Donald Trump arrested and booked. How Americans can overcome the great political, racial, and cultural divide.
What we need are bridge builders. Instead of left, instead of right, how do we go higher?
The indictment and arrest of former President Donald Trump have created a deep political divide in America. Leftists are elated, many conservatives outraged. So what is the way forward beyond politics? How can the people of the United States recover from deep political and cultural wounds? Well, joining us from Washington is Dr. David Anderson. He's a pastor, author, and founder of Gracism Global, an organization that bridges cultural, faith, race, and wealth divides in American society. So, David, thank you for being here. How should Christians respond to this unprecedented indictment and arrest of a former president who's also the leading opposition candidate to the current president of the United States?
Well, thank you, Gary, for having me on today. There's definitely no glory in former President Trump being arrested or turning himself in and having charges against him. So there's no glory in that kind of an indictment. And I think the way we respond as believers is soberly, with humility, and with temperance, regardless of what side of the political aisle you may find yourself on.
It's all about grace, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So no matter what happens, these wounds are deep. They won't disappear anytime soon. Family members and friends are divided over this, just as they were over the COVID pandemic. So how can we heal? Is it too soon to even think about reconciliation?
I think healing is important, not only politically, but culturally, racially. There's a lot of division, and that division was exposed and leveraged, and still is exposed and leveraged. The former president had a lot to do with that, stoking that. And then you have Democrats on the other side stoking it. And so if you have a lot of agitators or instigators, then it's just going to cause the wounds to continue to unfortunately hurt us. And so what we need are bridge builders, and we need healers to say, listen, I understand both sides, but how can we go forward? Instead of left, instead of right, how do we go higher? And I think that's what we're called to as believers.
And that's where churches come forward too, or should come forward, right? So there is division in Black and Hispanic communities over support for Donald Trump, and we've seen tweets where some African Americans are being called Uncle Toms or traitors to their race because of it. And so we're not only seeing racial divisions between races, but also within various racial groups. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, it's always difficult if you're a part of a minority group that has been oppressed historically, not to look at those who might be carrying a more minority view for the civil rights of that group to feel a certain kind of way. Having said that, if you're a gracist, if you're someone that's extending positive favor, then if you're a part of that racial group, for me, as an African American, the grace in me should say there's room enough for people who may not agree with maybe the majority of those who have fought for our civil rights for so long. And so we've got to make sure that as a people, our tent is big enough to celebrate all the different voices, even if we don't always agree.
Culturally, there are a lot of parents upset about the sexualization of children. Books and course instruction advancing an LGBTQ agenda in public schools. So our society is also polarized on the issue of abortion. How can there be reconciliation on traditional values issues?
Well, those values are so very important to us, right? To say what is marriage and what is life. So I think that those are important questions. What we have to ask is, how do you get to the bottom line of getting less abortions? How do you get to the bottom line of saying this is what God's ideal is, but this is the real that we live in? Bridge builders try to build a bridge between the real and the ideal. And there's some people who, whether you say one man, one woman for one lifetime, they may agree, but that's not their reality. They have divorced parents. They have a spouse that divorced them or that cheated, or they may feel attracted to to someone of the same sex. And so here's the ideal, but this is their real. To be a pastor, to be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ. Go where the real is and help build a bridge to where their ideal is. But when you politicize it, now we have to talk about, so what does that agenda look like in school? What does that agenda look like in the law? But bridge builders are always trying to build a bridge from the real to the ideal.
And quickly, what about gracism? What is it? Why is it important?
Well, I've mentioned being a gracist. You know, gracism is about extending positive favor to people regardless of, maybe even because of, their color, class, or culture. So gracism is this new term that emerges that says, how do we extend grace to people, whether they deserve it or not, whether they earn it or not, whether they can repay it or not? And God is the biggest gracist of us all. He extended grace to another race, even though we didn't deserve it. And that's what brought reconciliation between God and man. I think gracism is God's solution to racism. And if we would extend that kind of grace with regard to all of the different divisions we've been talking about, I believe that God can bring the healing that we all desire.
Okay, Dr. David Anderson, pastor, author, and your most recent book is Gracism, The Art of Inclusion. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
God bless you, Gary. Thank you.